I'd like to call the January 16th, 2025 meeting of the Land Use Advisory Committee to order. We have an agenda. If people don't have any objections, we will proceed with said agenda. I see a thumbs up and no shaking head, so we're good. We have minutes from November 21st of 2024. Do we have a motion and a second?
Motion to approve.
Thank you, Phil.
Second.
Kathy wins the arm wrestling fight for the second. Any corrections or discussion?
No, it's fine.
Not seeing any. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. We're good, we have minutes, yay. Okay, so we only have one information item today, and that would be Merritt telling us about planning assistant grants and support for Imagine 2050 comprehensive planning.
All right, thank you. Can I just advance right here? All right, thank you. Hello there. I'm Meredith Clapp-Smith, and I joined the local planning assistance team in May. This is my second time before you today. And I am going to walk you through some ideas for how we approach local planning assistance for this next cycle of comprehensive plan updates for Imagine 2050. And I've been taking a lot of time to look at our history with planning assistance grants in the past, and I'm also going to be introducing you to a new program idea for assistance this time. So today, during the agenda, we'll walk through first looking at the 2030 and 2040 comprehensive planning cycles and what the criteria were at that time for determining community eligibility for grants. Then we're going to consider whether we want to continue with the same criteria for grant eligibility for Imagine 2050 or modify those criteria, and I have some suggestions for you to consider. We will then look at what those proposed changes are, and following that we will move into talking about the new small communities program that we're considering for assistance in this next cycle and what the eligibility criteria for that might be. And I just want to note there was a lot of information in the memo. It's a lot of data. And a lot to get through, so at any point when I'm presenting, if you want clarification, let's just pause and take time to make sure everybody kind of understands where we're at, and then we can keep going. So under Minnesota statute, we have statutory authority to provide planning assistance, local planning assistance, and we can make arrangements with local government units to provide this for comprehensive community planning assistance. What it says under statute is that decisions about grants or loans from the council should be based on the recipient's demonstrated need and available financial resources. And I've underlined that because that is what the criteria are intended to address. So during each of these cycles, the council and its committees have considered how do we figure out what qualifies as need, financial need and technical need. So we'll begin here with the planning assistance grants for 2030 and 2040. So we had Framework 2030, and the grants were provided to communities by community type. We had unsewered, sewered, small cities, and county consortia. The number of grants provided in 2030 are shown there by each of those community types, and it was a total of 50 grants. The grant levels ranged from $15,000 to $50,000, and it was a total of just over $1 million that was provided in grants. For Thrive MSP 2040, the criteria were adjusted, and we'll talk about that. And the budget was different as well. So in that case, it was almost $1,900,000 in grants, and grants were provided to 70 communities, ranging from 20,000 to 84,000. And we'll talk in a moment about this. The 84,000 level is for counties that still work on land use planning for their townships, or for a consortium of 5 or more communities that come together and do their planning as a group. So it provides some efficiencies, and so that higher grant level is met.
I'm Chair, I have a question on this.
Yeah.
So do we grant up to the total of the budget each time, or do we have situations where we might have budgeted, say in 2030, budgeted $1.5 million, but only $1 million in grants were provided, or do we just give grants until we've used up the budget?
We identify what the budget is, and then so as we go, it's a better iterative process of identifying criteria. You figure out how many communities are eligible, you look at your budget number, and then you kind of determine, based on the grant levels we want to provide, how many communities can we serve. We'll do some fine tuning on the criteria, so you then try to hit the eligibility level so it fit with the amount available in your total budget. It looks like last time almost every, or maybe all eligible communities for grants did take the grants, but they are optional. They could choose not to take a grant even if they're eligible. Does that answer?
Yep.
Why would they not want the grant?
Well, I don't know. Yes.
I'm Chair and committee member, I could probably give some insight. We've had conversations with communities where they have struggled with, do we really want to take the grant or not? And a lot of times it's a philosophical difference between the mission of the council and what the local government really holds near and dear. In the grant contract, they are required to be in conformance with council system plans and consistent with council regional policies. They have to do that anyway, but the grant actually ties them to that very specifically. And so sometimes it's a fear of being required to do more than what they want to do, even though it's the same level of requirement across the board.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, the reason I asked was I was trying to get a sense for, are people taking advantage of the grants, or are we finding that we're not getting as much uptake as we'd like? So that helps.
Yeah. One other thing.
Chair. Let's let
sorry.
Angela
Yeah.
finish that one, and then
It's okay. I'll also say in that the grants are non-competitive, and we only expend the full amount for the community. We do half up front and then half at the end. So the only time we would have budget left in the grant fund is if on the back end they didn't complete something in time, or there were some other challenges and the last half of the grant wasn't distributed to the community.
did we have anybody not do theirs?
We did have, I think, 2 or 3 communities where we weren't able to distribute the last half because they still don't have their plans done, and they may have been grant communities, but now it is so far behind when the contract would have been required them to have that done. And of course, the grant contracts also reflect the statutory timelines and any extensions that the council might offer, but sometimes communities are still lagging behind that, and we try to be as generous with that time as possible, but sometimes it just gets a little too far and we just have to call it at some point.
Well, and the challenge is if you're a really small community with nothing changing, there's no penalty for not getting it done. Because the only time it really comes up is if you need an amendment, but if nothing's changing, yeah, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I was curious as how, do we have data or track how much communities spend to do this planning? Because that, to me, could have to play into some of this as well.
That is an excellent question. There was an effort to track that, and so after the last cycle of grants, all of the participating communities were asked to self-report on how much they actually spend. We did not have really clear standards about how they would calculate that, and so I think there was a thought from the people that gathered the data that maybe communities hadn't been completely consistent on how they reported it. So some of them just reported money they spent out of their budget, some included the value of staff time as kind of an in-kind. But what we did see even across that is that communities Most of the communities were spending more and often significantly more than the amount of the grant money they had received. And in general, the larger cities tended to exceed the budget even more. I think just because they already have some financial means and staff in place to put into comprehensive planning, where the very, very smallest communities are just very limited in what they can put towards these things.
Thank you.
So the criteria used for grant eligibility in 2030 and 2040, there are 4 components of it. The first one is net tax capacity of a community. And this is used in comparison to the region's median capacity. The median capacity, or the metro median, as you often see referred to, is kind of the midway point. So people who exceed the median are half of the communities in the region have net tax capacity higher than that, and half are lower than the metro median. In 2030, the criteria for net tax capacity was based on the overall capacity of the community. But in 2040, it was decided that the criteria should look at net tax capacity per capita. So if you have 2 communities that have the same overall capacity of, let's say, $1 million, but one of them is a third the size of another, then I think they felt that you really wanted to consider per capita, how much activity, services, everything do they need to be spending with that tax capacity. The second criteria that has been looked at is the 30-year forecasted population growth rate. And again, this has been compared to the regional median. So if the region, say this time based on forecasted growth, the regional median growth rate is 16%. And so people who are growing less than 16% are considered to be growing less than the metro median, or greater than 16% more. Third is the current population of the community. That's just a flat number. It might be 513 people or 250,000. And finally, it's the consortium, county or consortium planning approach. So this can apply to Carver and Scott County, where they still do the planning for their township, so they are eligible for the county level grants. Or you can be a consortium of 5 or more communities who come together, and you might hire a single consultant, for instance, and you're sort of working on your updates as a group. This has been used in the past 2 cycles by Dakota County communities. Some of the townships and small rural centers that are near each other, they have a lot of the same issues, and so they have gotten a grant to work as a consortium on their update. So looking at the eligibility criteria and options for local planning grants in 2030 and 2040, again, there's a lot of information on this slide. So what you see in the first column is this is net tax capacity. And again, it's compared to the metro median. And so in these tables, we call the metro median 100%. So if you're more than 100%, then you have a higher financial capacity than the median. If you're less than 100%, it's lower. You'll note again on this that in 2030, it was an overall net tax capacity. And for 2040, it was measured as a per capita capacity. For the 30-year, let's look down in the gray shaded area at 2040 for Thrive. So during Thrive, there were 3 different ways you could be eligible. One was category A. So if you were a community that had a net tax capacity per capita less than the metro median, and your growth rate was equal to or higher than the metro median, then you were eligible for a grant. Or if you were a community with a population less than or equal to 5,000 and your net tax capacity per capita was less than or equal to 125% of the metro median, you were eligible. Or if you were a county or consortium. So if you fit any of those criteria, you were identified as an eligible community.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So with the per capita net tax capacity, was there a lot of differentiation between cities that have a lot of business and don't have a lot of business? Because a big part of, if you have businesses, you're gonna have more tax capacity based on the businesses, not just homes.
Right.
Was that a big differentiator or not?
I didn't look at the data that closely around sort of business activity. I think what stood out most to me in looking at the data, because I put together the data set for this next round, is that some of the very smallest rural communities in our region, particularly the townships, have relatively high net tax capacity per capita. And I think that might be related to the agricultural lands. And so even though those communities might be very small and limited in kind of any staff or expertise for planning, they are missing qualifying for criteria for grants because they have high net tax capacity per capita. So a comparison of grant eligible communities for 2040 and 2050. So in this table, I took the criteria that were used for 2040, and I used the updated data that we currently have now for tax capacity for these communities, the forecasted growth in the population, and I examined how many communities would be eligible if we carried forward those same criteria. So in the first column, the pink one, you see how many communities that were eligible under Thrive 2030 would also be eligible for Thrive 2040 for Imagine 2050. And you can see that 56 communities are eligible under both. Newly eligible communities this round that weren't last time, that would be 8 communities that would be eligible now. And there would be 13 that are no longer eligible. So an example of the no longer eligible communities, if we kept the criteria, 6 of those are no longer eligible because their growth rate is now lower than the metro median, which used to be a criteria. You had to have a high growth rate, and they now have a low growth rate. 6 of them now don't qualify because their net tax capacity is better than the metro median, so they've fallen out of eligibility. And the last one is a community whose population now exceeds 5,000. So that's an example of the things that can change. Any questions on this one?
Well, just the comment that if the growth is slowed down, you probably don't have as much work as you're gonna have to do.
That's yeah, I think that's something we'll talk about.
Okay.
Yeah. I also just want to say here that this analysis is purely based on criteria. This does not consider what the budget is going to be for next time around or the grant levels. So again, we're going to have to size the criteria to kind of fit the budget, the number of communities we want to serve. So this is just looking at the criteria.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Meryl, then, so right now, we don't know what the budget's going to be then, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, I don't know what the budget's gonna be.
Assuming they get back in
I'm sorry, I
session,
didn't hear what you
but yeah.
We don't know how much we're gonna have allocated for grants yet.
That's good.
The council will make that decision in the next year.
Yeah, so we'll have an overall budget. So one of the decisions with that budget is you know, how many communities do you wanna serve, and do you wanna serve more communities at lower grant levels, or do you wanna serve fewer communities with higher grant levels? I mean, that's one of the considerations. So, in looking at Thrive 2040 and communities that receive grants and considering this upcoming round, there were a number of things I observed that I thought would be good for us to discuss. So the types of communities that are not served under the current grant criteria. The biggest group is communities that are larger than a 5,000 population, but they have low net tax capacity and slow growth. So they're financially not as well off as a lot of other communities in the region, but they're growing slowly. As it turns out, many of the more financially challenged communities are also slow-growing communities. Large, fast-growing communities are eligible. Well, many of the so large, say bigger cities that are fast-growing are eligible under current criteria, but many of the slower-growing medium and small communities are not. The Met Council expectations for what has to be included in a comprehensive plan update are the same, whether or not you have a slow or fast-growing community. The biggest differentiator in what we look for in our comprehensive plans is whether you're inside the MUSA or outside the MUSA. There are a number of minimum requirements that you don't have to be concerned with if you're outside the MUSA.
So is there any way that we can streamline things, you know, rather than just keeping paying for more and more work? Is there a way that we can because we've talked about having comp plan light for, I don't know, 15 years, and it never seems to happen. Do we need to have a legislative permission to do that, or are there some things that we can try to streamline within our processes to help the workload?
Chair and committee members, that's what we'll be talking about with the Small Communities Program, but the Metropolitan Land Planning Act statutory requirements apply to all communities that are within the council's jurisdiction. So there wouldn't be like a community that wouldn't have to do a comp plan, for example.
No, I'm not saying not have to do a comp plan, but are there going to be so many changes that if you don't have a lot of growth, you can't just paste in your stuff from the last one?
There are some things that change all the time. The local forecasts will always change. So there are different regulations and requirements, like the new climate requirements. So there's always going to be a series of things that might be different. There are a lot of things that communities carry over decade to decade to decade anyway, and they can certainly still do that. We're hoping with the Small Communities Program, we can lighten that load even more for them. A lot of that information we have, and we would be able to help do that. We'll talk about that.
And do we know how much it's gonna cost per city to do the new climate stuff that the legislature required? Do we have an idea at all yet?
I don't.
That would be
We
a
don't
good
know.
thing to know, because
We don't yet know what
everybody's
the
gonna be,
requirements are.
okay, yeah, because everybody's gonna be hit with that extra cost, and it would be good to know what that's going to be. Okay.
Okay.
Keep going.
So the last bullet of note, and this is kind of a theory I'm positing that I think is worth, that we can consider, which is that slow growth and low net tax capacity is common in older developed communities. Those communities still need to do a lot of good planning and sometimes very challenging planning to consider infill and redevelopment, affordable housing, and engagement with diverse populations. So even though they're slow growing, they still have a lot of work to do when they consider their comprehensive plans. So I think we should consider whether, when we're thinking about the need of a community for planning assistance, as we're directed to do under Minnesota statute, whether fast growth necessarily indicates a higher level of need than slow growth, or if maybe they're a little bit more equivalent, and we don't emphasize the fast growth quite as much in the criteria, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, but just kind of to start thinking about that. So potential approach to serve these communities is to revise the grant eligibility criteria to better reach low net tax capacity per capita communities. The second type of communities not served under current criteria are very small communities with relatively strong net tax capacity. So some of the region's smallest communities, as I mentioned, aren't eligible due to higher net tax capacity. But despite them having a higher tax base, these small communities often lack the time or the professional expertise or the resources to review comprehensive plan requirements, even know how to prepare a request for proposals for consultants, or to review consultant proposals and documents. So a potential approach to serve these communities is to initiate a technical planning assistance for comprehensive plan updates under the new Small Communities Program. And the criteria would be based on combined consideration of financial and professional capacity. And we'll talk more about that in a moment.
I have a question about, so you had mentioned before
Yeah.
the agricultural communities, and Scott, Carver, and Dakota have most of the agriculture. There's a little bit in Hennepin and a little bit in Inoka, a little bit in Washington, but the majority are in those three counties. So the first two are already covered under the county program.
Correct.
Are you proposing that perhaps some of the Dakota County small cities or not small cities, but small townships would then be in the small community thing instead, or would you propose still keeping them under the consortium?
Well, I've talked to some of the small community representatives at, I think, the meeting we were at in the fall that you spoke at about this, and also talked to one of the Dakota County planners and the consultant that worked with them last time. And I think they potentially have an interest in doing the consortium approach again. Unfortunately, most of those communities that used that program last time have pretty high net tax capacity per capita, so they wouldn't be eligible for grants. So I think using that approach could still be a good option for them if they want to do that.
Okay. And would they?
They would still qualify for the consortium.
But
Yes,
if they
yes.
didn't like the experience they had with the consortium, could they do the small communities thing instead? Because they're really small.
Let's look at the criteria and then we'll talk more about that. All right, so let's move now to talking about proposed revisions to eligibility criteria for the grants. So we'll still just focus on the grants. Okay. This is where I take a moment to say that there are a number of typos that are in this PowerPoint. So Angela worked very closely with me on the memo and then the PowerPoint. And we made, after a conversation with you, which I'm sorry I missed on Monday, we made a lot of updates to try to make things clear and a little easier to read. And in that process, not all of that clarity transferred from the memo to this PowerPoint, and I apologize for that. And so in this case,
Did the PowerPoint not get the newest one to Greg? Is that what's going on?
Yes,
Is there any way to get it to him quick or no?
I mean, I can try, but I think that,
Or you just wanna go ahead with the
I
old
think
one?
Yeah.
that this is fine. The content and
Yes.
concepts haven't changed. There might be some title changes, like this is option A, B, and C, just a little bit reorganized, but there isn't anything that changed substantially.
Okay.
Just,
Yeah.
we're trying to make things a little more clear, and
Yeah.
we are where we're at today.
yeah, so
Sorry.
focus on the content, not the letters and numbers. All All right, so proposed new options for grant eligibility. What you see here as option D is in the memo referred to as option A. So under,
So the printed one is the new one, the screen is the old one.
yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
thinking.
The printed is correct.
Yeah.
In both the memo and the PowerPoint.
It was on the website.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It is posted correctly.
Okay.
I'm starting with a base from which I have lots of room for improvement, so. So,
We can work with it, it's fine. Everything's fine.
all right, so option D, also known as the option A.
How's that?
Yeah. So this would modify that first set of criteria from Thrive. It would be the same as that first set of criteria with the modification that it would only be eligible to communities that have a population under 25,000. And the reason I'm proposing this is looking, it jumped out at me when I was reviewing who would be eligible this time. And one of what I think of as the most well-resourced communities with really a lot of strong planning staff and whatnot was popping up on the list as eligible for a grant when a lot of medium and smaller communities that really struggle weren't appearing. And I thought, well, maybe we need to think about that the largest communities don't need the grant support quite as much as some of the medium and smaller communities. So if we were to alter this, it would mean that we would be focusing grants to communities that have a population under 25,000 in this case. This would reduce the eligibility under this criteria from 43 communities to 33. That reduction would enable us to provide more grants to medium and smaller communities. Under options E and F, which are also referred to as B and C.
Before we get to
Yeah,
that, I have a question
Yeah.
about option A. Or
Yeah, yes,
C,
thank
whatever you
you.
wanna call it. So is there, I don't wanna set somebody up into a position where they're at like $24.99 and they end up at 24,999 and they end up at 25,001. Is that a place where there's not a whole bunch of people right at the margins, or?
Yes, right, that's correct. There aren't really people who are hanging out at that margin.
Okay.
So the next two options, this would really focus on the communities that have significantly lower net tax capacity. So we're looking at communities that are equal to or less than 75% of the metro median. So these are the really more financially challenged communities. Again, many of these do have low growth as well. So under this, one of the options would be for this could be a single criteria, but I just wanted to compare. If you looked at those communities that are growing at a rate of 7 to 16%, 16% is the metro median, or those that are actually under 7%, so really low growing. Of those sort of middle communities, 18 would become eligible between those two. And these would serve half of the communities that were eligible or would be eligible if you use the criteria under Thrive that was for communities under 5,000. So remember there was that, you have net tax capacity less than 125%, less than 5,000. Those communities, half of those would be covered by this new proposed options of these two combined. And they could just be single, it could just be for any community that's under the metro median that meets the other criteria, but since I know growth rate was important last time and the focus was just on higher growth rate, wanted you to just be able to think about, do you Are you willing to consider grants to communities that are just a little bit slower growth rate or, truly not much growth at all? Any questions?
Madam Chair, could we do different grant rates for the two different options, for under 7, giving them more than maybe the 7 to 16? Was that thought of too, or is it just using this as one criteria?
That's a choice that can be made, yeah. So as I said last time, there were 3 different ways you could become eligible for a grant. It could be, and we propose to continue using the county and consortium one, so that's one. So this time you want 2 other options for the way people could be eligible, 3 other options. That's a decision you can make. And the grant levels then can be, in the past it's been associated with whether you were a community that was in the MUSA, whether you were unsewered, so the levels of grant were more about kind of where a community is in the region and the type of community. I hadn't really thought about changing that piece of it.
But the world is your oysters.
As if there wasn't enough to think about here.
Okay.
All right. So if we compare kind of what I've proposed here, so you can see at the top in the gray, these were the 3 ways you could be eligible for Thrive. In the white are these different options that I just described for Imagine 2050. In the first case, your community that has a net tax capacity per capita that's less than or equal to the metro median, what we call 100%. And your growth rate is greater than or equal to the metro median, which is 16%. In the next option, you are a community that's not as financially well off. This is the case for both of the next 2. Your net tax capacity is less than or equal to 75%. And again, you're between 7%, 16% growth or less than or equal to 7%. Oh, an important note on the stop one again, what it should say under current population there for that, what you see on the slide is option D. It's population less than 25,000. So that was the differentiating change this time. So I'm about to turn to the small communities program, but do we want to pause and talk a little any more about kind of what I just laid out for grant options?
So one of the things that I was thinking about with the small communities that maybe have redevelopment but not rapid growth is typically in those scenarios, you're looking at like a small area plan or something for that redevelopment area. Is that maybe better served by using the livable communities planning grants for those small area plans for redevelopment rather than the whole community development grant program?
I'm not sure what you mean, Chair.
So like,
the livable communities,
they have planning grants that they can do
yes,
for redevelopment.
yes. Those are for projects though, projects by projects, right? The comprehensive planning is, they could do you're right, a small area plan, like a
To
downtown.
be ready for
Yes.
development,
Yes,
redevelopment,
they can.
yes.
They're not excluded from doing the LCA program grants by doing any of these programs.
No, but I'm saying that for some communities, they might not need as much on the actual comp plan as they did where they're trying to redevelop. If the other stuff is kind of paced except for the new requirements, the figuring out the redevelopment part kind of comes more under livable communities than it does under community development, or am I wrong?
If you would like to make that distinction in this grant program, that's up to the committee.
Well, if it's a
and yourself,
question
but it is.
is it kind of more in that sort of work than the ones every 10 years? Is it more as these places become available
Right.
or proposed?
So, in my experience in planning for different communities and doing like small area plans, I think you could potentially do a small area plan where you anticipate how it will impact your next comprehensive plan update and the kind of things you need to address in the comprehensive plan, and that might be helpful. But you still have to do that whole comprehensive plan piece. It certainly might help them get ready.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree with you with what you're saying. What if there's, we have a comprehensive plan, if these small communities don't change that much, why does it have to be, we can just change a small portion of it and then diddle the rest of it and just push it through and be done with it? Why do we have to go back and reinvent the wheel and do all this, and spend thousands of dollars to get this plan put back together again?
Well, there's some things that you have to update, like your stormwater plan is required to be
Right.
updated, and then we've got the new climate change.
The climate change is a big one, yeah.
Yeah. How many other things have to change?
There's a lot, because we reflect all of the policy stuff and the minimum requirements, but a community can put as much into, like, starting from scratch or pulling as much from their previous plan and still applies as they want. They don't have to do more than the minimum requirements state that they have to do. So if they do want to copy and paste all of the things that are still relevant, they can certainly do that. There's nothing that prevents them from that. Usually what happens though is that when their forecasts change, their affordable housing need number might change, their land use might change. So it's a little bit of a ripple effect. Forecast, affordable housing, wastewater, land use, they're all really kind of connected. And so usually if there's a change in one, there's a subsequent change in other things. And so I think Greg is uploading the
Oh,
correct
good.
PowerPoint.
So that we can stop having multiple letters.
Yes, thank you. And so we try and work with them to provide, one, as much stuff as, like, we'll meet minimum requirements, here's what we would accept as a minimum, if you wanna use that, here you go. We try and provide that to them. We also try and provide kind of that base understanding of, you don't have to do more than these minimum requirements, and this is what that might look like. And we try and help them make all of the necessary changes as easily as possible. But comprehensive planning is a big effort. It is necessary, and it's every 10 years, so it's not something that we ask every year, but it is something that usually requires just a new look at things from at least a high level. And, you know, local governments often have other things that they want to include, like, well, we just did this downtown stuff, and so we want to make sure that that's in our comp plan now. And so they're taking the last 10 years worth of local planning efforts that they've done and implementing that in the comp plans as well. So it usually ends up being a little bit of a ripple effect.
Sure.
So
I guess I was looking at it more of on the side of making sure everybody can get to the minimum without being financially stressed.
Yeah.
Rather than give, you know, some people a Cadillac and some people get a Yugo.
well, we try to help those that have, you know, my aunt used to have a Yugo. It was a
My brother-in-law had a Yugo too. He had to pay somebody to take it away at the
Oh
end.
my goodness, yeah, anyway, so, I'll leave it at that.
So I saw that Jerry had his hand up and then Kathy.
Couple things, just so I make sure I understand what's going on. By law, you have to fill out your comp plans.
Yes.
Do a lot of these communities bellyache about it, and that's why the Met Council is offering grants?
I would guess
To
that
do
all
it?
communities bellyache
I
to
think
some
everybody bellyaches about it, yeah.
Was that the whole purpose of these grants then?
Well, it's to help ease the financial burden on communities that are having a need to, like the first slide, that had the criteria. And, you know, some communities make their plan a couple hundred pages long, and some people make their plan 1,600 pages long. It's not required to be that long, but some people like to be wordier.
Well, I can understand, I'm coming from a township, I would guess we're in the low end of this. You know, our comp plans aren't usually change much, whatever, but my other one is, you referred twice or 3 times to this climate change that's coming. I've never heard of it, could you kind of say more about it so when it's brought up, I understand what's going on here?
Sure, Chair and committee members, at the last legislative session, not the one that just started, but last year, the legislature adopted new minimum climate, a requirement for climate to be, climate mitigation and adaptation to be considered as part of comprehensive planning. And so that is not something that's been required by the Metropolitan Council before. As part of the comprehensive planning process, we have a lot of communities in the region that have local climate action plans already. So there's a lot of planning work around that going on. But now this will be the first planning round where it's required in all comprehensive plans to be addressed.
And we don't yet know what all of the rules are going to be.
Correct. We're working on that with local governments now.
So I imagine in the bill or whatever it was, there's how many things make up the list that you have to do.
It sets a general expectation. We have some expectations around forecasting that our research department takes care of. We've got some transportation requirements that we're working with MnDOT on. A lot of it's around emissions and vehicle miles traveled reductions and some of those things, the data side of it. The comprehensive planning requirement essentially requires that it's in comprehensive plans, and the Met Council has to establish what those requirements will look like for local governments. I would expect that a comprehensive plan requirement for addressing climate adaptation and mitigation would look very different in Meesville than it would Minneapolis. And so we don't expect that requirements will be the same for every community. We have community designations. I would expect that they would kind of go along that kind of designation-based requirements. But townships, the county would obviously take care of the township's planning requirements, and we're working with local governments now to work through some of what those minimums would look like. The council has a lot of technical tools already developed, especially around GHG, around emission.
Greenhouse gas.
Greenhouse gas emissions and strategies and priorities. We've got some tools where communities can kind of pick their path on how to meet new requirements. We're not setting specific targets as far as I know. We're requiring that specific strategies and priorities be addressed locally and that they do work towards addressing the state requirements, which do have targets and do have specific numbers tied to them.
Yeah, the state has come up with new things, like if you're gonna put in a new interchange, you've gotta do so much, either build trails or buy carbon credits or take that, and that's still being figured out too, but that's gonna make it a little more challenging to improve our highway system, a little more expensive.
We don't expect local governments to do any modeling. We've already done that, and we've got a lot of data and tools and resources available, kind of ready to go. But we'll continue to be working on some of that stuff over the next couple of years as well.
Madam Chair, my question is going back to these small communities, do we have any way to just create a template for these? So then when there are little changes made, they're just entering it into a formula and it's coming back out? Because I feel like yeah, we're giving them the grants, but they don't know, you know, like we talked about the request for proposal and all those things that they may not have the staff for. Why are we forcing that on to the cities? And I know there's a statutory requirement, but then we have internal staff that is probably more geared toward helping them.
And that is a great
That's a
segue
great
into the next
segue.
section of the presentation, so.
Great minds think alike.
And before I segue, I think a big body of work that the local planning assistance team is gonna have in the coming months is to prepare technical resources and support for the comprehensive planning updates. And I think often communities do ask for templates for things or just really clear guidance about what the expectations are and how they'll know if they've met them. And that was feedback from the last round as well, and I think we're taking that very seriously. Like, a lot of us have been in these communities doing comprehensive plans, and so we understand what it's like to get that guidance from that council and be trying to figure it out. So I think we're really trying to work hard to be as clear as possible and to provide support materials as best we can.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. The other thing too is on the maps that was provided, Meryl, the ones that I've got here on that just recent,
Yeah.
there's stuff from 2016. Is there a way that we could update those so we know, so the communities look at this and look at 120% metro, median, and it's like, okay, where am I?
Yeah.
And so on the map, it lists, where it shows a map, number one, but also
Right.
lists the communities and what they actually are eligible for. And I understand that you don't know what that number is as far as what's being provided, as far as a grant money. But that would be helpful to put that out there, because I know we're a community in Hugo of a little over 15,000 people. And the last go-around that we had, it cost us $125,000. That doesn't include staff time to
Right.
do this
Right.
Yeah,
deal,
this
and
is-
it's expensive. So-
Yeah, it is. So the list and the map that was attached to the memo you got, that was published after the decision had been made last round, what the criteria were they were gonna use and then who was eligible. And certainly as I was analyzing data, you don't wanna put out a map or a list when you're still considering the criteria, because someone might see themselves on the list and say, oh, phew,
Yeah.
we're gonna be getting a good grant, and then suddenly the criteria changes and they're off the list. But as this group and other discussions refine the criteria and we feel pretty solid about it, then we can start to produce what those official lists might be, so.
It's good, thank you.
And I know, communities should already be kind of thinking about this, and I think, as we said, even with grants, those never cover everything, so it's still good for everybody to budget. And then if they find themselves on a list for eligibility, then maybe they can just take a little bit of the budget, put it into something else.
Even in the last round, so Dakota County had the consortium thing, and then Dakota County put in even more money than we did.
Yeah.
And they still had to get money out of the townships in small cities to get the final full amount, so.
If I may. Yeah, I think with this environmental thing, a lot of communities are going to do a deep dive into redoing all their comprehensive plans. I know as I know, I talked to our staff, that's exactly what we're planning on, because we're going to have to redo a lot of things. This is going to be a major cost.
Well, I don't get to be part of the budget decision.
We'll make sure and make that known for council members.
Well, we still, just a second, no, and I'll get you. We still have it's up in the air 3 versus 4 for the minimum density for the suburban edge too. And that may mean more updates to some of the engineering stuff with infrastructure. So, but we won't know that until we're gonna have a showdown next Tuesday at community development and we'll see how that turns out. Okay, go on.
Madam Chair, yeah, I was just curious, maybe this is an unrealistic, situation, but if the budget that was set aside for the grants was underutilized by a certain point, would there be like flexibility on the eligibility criteria? Like if a town was at like 28,000
Right.
over that criteria, could you send something out that's like, yeah, we can flex on these criteria in order to spend the money that we set aside?
We've never done that before, because we schedule out to the full budget amount. And so all of those funds would be dedicated to the eligible communities. And so if a community decides not to accept the grant, those funds would probably go back into the Planning Assistance Grant Fund for interest regeneration for the next round.
Gotcha.
It's usually not, I think that, like I said, I think that we had 3, maybe half payments of grants that didn't go out this last time, so the budget's usually fully expended.
How many cities or townships do we have left that are still not done?
4.
And let me ask if that's a segue. Are all of those pretty small communities?
3 of 4.
Okay.
Well, geographic or population? Population, yes.
Okay, all right. With that, should we move to our next piece?
Yes.
Okay. So despite grants, some of the very smallest communities in the region still struggle with their comprehensive plan updates. So the idea of providing direct technical assistance to some of the smallest communities to update their comp plans, I understand, has been considered and talked about for several years here. And it's been observed that these smallest communities often are the ones that struggle the most with the updates. So even when consultants are hired, they sometimes lack the staff, or they have heavy reliance on volunteer service to review planning work, and it can lead to delays. There's limited time to engage with Met Council staff, or even with consultants to move through that comprehensive planning process. So the idea of a proposed small communities program would be, in addition to the grant program, that would be one bucket through budget. And then alongside that, there would be a new technical assistance program. So the goal would be to provide this assistance to eligible communities to update their comprehensive plans. It would reduce the burden of those updates on those communities that have the least capacity to manage them. And so the method would be that the local planning assistance team would hire 2 to 3 temporary staff. Temporary staff is defined as people who are working for up to 2 years. They would join the team and they would lead the technical work of the comprehensive plan updates for the communities that are eligible to be participants in this program. So as with the grants, we would need to determine who would be eligible for this program by establishing criteria. And so looking at the grants, I tried to use the same set of criteria, looking at net tax capacity per capita, looking at their 30-year population growth rate and their current population. We're trying to focus on the very smallest communities. So in this case, at each level, all of these communities are under a population of 2,500. So the way I've set this up, and I really tried to look at the communities and think about those I know. Sometimes the very, very tiniest communities, they might have a population of 350, but they still have kind of a high net tax capacity per capita. But in knowing those communities, I know it's very hard for them to do these comprehensive plan updates. So I scaled these different levels such that in level 1, if your net tax capacity is less than or equal to 125% of the metro median, your growth rate is less than the metro median and you're under 2,500, you'd be eligible. This would be 17 communities. It happens that if I look back at the grant criteria that I suggested we consider this time, 10 of those would also be eligible for a grant. Now what we're suggesting is you you might find yourself on an eligibility list for being part of this program or getting a grant, and you can choose whether you want to participate in one or the other. You wouldn't be both. And again, this is always, if you're identified as eligible, it's your option to participate. You're not required, and it's not competitive.
So how would that work in terms of projecting numbers of cities if they, personnel versus a grant, how would we do
It's
the math on that?
It's an art and not a science. I tried, I started getting into this and all of it relates to one another because of that overlap, so I tried to design it so that if you kind of hit the midpoint of some people going with one and some with the other, you kind of hit the right level you need. Because what we need to think about is if we have 2 to 3 staff, how many comprehensive plans can we realistically get done? And I think we settled on maybe between 20 or 30, if it's really for these smallest communities. We're very efficient, we're very thoughtful, we've created our own internal templates, that it would be arranged there. But if we
20 or 30 total or 20
Total.
or 30 per a new employee?
Oh goodness, no, total.
total. And once we get, I'll just say, once we get into it, if we're finding that however many people signed up for the program, that those 2 to 3 staff are struggling to get through it, then other people on the team can pitch in.
Yep.
If we're finding that those people are just knocking it out of the park and they have extra time on their hands, then they'll help with other stuff in the opiate program. So at level 2, these are communities under 1,000. They would be eligible if they had a net tax capacity up to 150%. And if they were under 500, they'd have a net tax capacity up to 175%. It's interesting, a lot of our rural centers or very, very small communities actually have pretty high net tax capacity per capita. So there's a whole set of small communities that aren't eligible under this program because they're in very good position financially.
So that makes me think about the really tiny communities like New Trier is officially 87 people, but I think they're down to 83 now,
Yeah.
And Meesville has like 125. How hard would it be, are they in that? Are those really tiny ones in that, or how hard would it be to, that's like a block in a lot of communities.
Yeah. Some are and some aren't. And it could certainly be that the council decides that for this program, it wants to allow anybody that's under, 300 just into the program.
That's kind of what I'm
And then
getting
from
at.
them, you figure out, all right, well, how many is that, and can we afford to take on any more?
Yeah.
So that's certainly a decision, yeah. But there are some of these, there are some communities that are tiny, but they're like among the very wealthiest enclaves of the region, with the $14 million homes.
Yeah, like the
So-
Lake Minnetonka Beach or
Right,
something.
right. So I was trying to get at that with net tax capacity, where you're going up to 175%, but maybe you don't want to go too high. I didn't mention I did interviews with different planners around the region, some different consultants, people who've worked with a lot of these smallest communities, and I kind of tested this idea about, well, should you just be eligible if you're really tiny regardless of how wealthy you are? And most people felt like no, because we still have a lot that are small that really have financial need.
Yeah, and I wasn't thinking about the little enclaves by lakes, I was
Right.
thinking about like
Yeah.
little rural centers and
Yeah.
things like that. So it would be helpful to be able to differentiate between that and know how many little tiny places
Yeah.
are not all millionaires living in them, because that's different.
Yeah, and that
They
kind of,
don't qualify.
Well, and I don't, but when you're looking at numbers, I don't know, I don't know if New Trier has a whole,
Also, they participate in the collaborative too.
And that was my next question is
Yes.
having information about collaborative versus the small things, how big of an overlap is that?
So one of our last questions after we get through this is what additional information will be helpful as we continue to consider this? And I could certainly look at those kind of numbers, like all of the communities under 500, how many would be eligible here, and of the ones that aren't, what are those sort of next thresholds?
Yeah.
And
But
describe
I
that
think
more.
about like landfall is tiny, and I assume that it doesn't have a very high net
No,
tax
it
capacity.
absolutely falls into qualifying, I think, for both the grant and this program.
Okay.
I can't remember its exact population, but yeah.
Madam Chair, I think that is good, especially in the under 500 category, to look at some of those next thresholds
Yeah.
and see kind of where things fall. Because certainly, we want to make sure we're including people that ought to be eligible and excluding people who don't really need to be, yeah.
Right sizing the
And
program.
do any of these, under the eligible community numbers, do any of those already participate in consortiums, or have you already kind of weeded those out of these?
I've set aside all of the Scott and Carver County ones because they're gonna be working with
They're
their.
automatic.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
automatic working with
Yeah,
their
okay.
counties.
I just wanted to understand.
I did include the Dakota County ones in this general pool when I did the evaluation, but as I mentioned, most of those consortium communities from Dakota County have a pretty high net tax capacity.
And I don't know what high means, like 175% or above that.
More like 200, 250%.
And that gets back to the business thing, because part of their stuff is farms, which are essentially businesses, which is the downside of the
Right.
per capita.
This is small and it's hard to read. It's easier in the memo, but it's just kind of the overview of how all these things differ across the different things, which I think we've talked through pretty well.
Which table is that in?
The last one.
It's on page 17.
Oh, yeah, and it unfortunately gets broken.
Oh, did it break across the
breaks-
page?
Yeah.
Yeah. There were a lot of-
Look at
yeah.
the little one.
There were a lot of tables in the memo. There's a lot of space when we try to avoid the breaking across a page. Yeah, but I think we've been through this again. The questions on the table are for the grants. Do we try to focus our grant money more towards some of the medium and smaller communities by adding a criteria that to be eligible, you have to have a population under 25,000 or some number that kind of eliminates the largest cities that have the most resources from eligibility? I think that's a big question. And then as we look at the other options, are we willing to consider providing grants to communities that aren't growing as quickly? They have a slower growth rate than the metro median, because we believe that although they're growing more slowly, they still have a lot to think about when they're doing their planning. And that the burden of a comprehensive plan amendment isn't that much different for them than it is for a fast growth community.
Are the B and C, do they have any population limit or, because you got 25,000 under A.
No. No, it's just focusing on the really low net tax capacity. I mean, we could consider that certainly.
No, because I'm just trying to picture in my head what that means,
Yeah.
you know, for a community.
And I'll just mention automatically under Minnesota statute, Minneapolis and St. Paul are never eligible.
And I wasn't
Yeah.
figuring, that their net tax capacity is pretty decent.
And Madam Chair, yeah.
Not per
I-
capita.
I guess in my opinion, Mayor, I think it would make more sense to get as many communities involved with these programs as much as possible.
Mhm.
And then I guess, Just go from there and just give it a try and see where it goes. I think that makes the most sense, because it spreads it out and hopefully more communities will be able to participate in this program. It would be helpful though, again, is to let them know where they fall in these programs.
Yeah.
Their availability.
So is that an argument for getting rid of, say, a population cap on the first one or something
Yes.
like that? Make it more broad?
Yes.
That's what you're saying?
Oh, you're talking about making option A not,
Related to population.
To
Alright.
70% Metro medium.
I will, I know this was in the memo and I can't remember the exact number, but the criteria for grant eligibility under Thrive qualified, a certain number of communities in designing the options or the proposals for grants under Imagine 2050. I set the criteria so that we ended up with almost the same number of communities that would be eligible. The difference was that the eligibility shifted more to medium and smaller communities that had more significant financial constraints.
well, there was something like 10 communities that dropped off under A by making it 25,000.
Right, so some dropped off, some were added. I mean, the hard thing is there are a lot of communities that aren't eligible under any scenario. I mean, so our grants, it's great, and yet we can only touch a certain number of communities. Pardon me. So we just have to decide how we're focusing our dollars, like who we feel we most need to reach, again, because statute says that we need to focus on kind of the need.
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes.
In that case, if these smaller communities don't have to change a lot in their plan, can these 2 to 3 folks that the Met Council that are temporary, could they actually help do them or help do that for them?
That's the program suggestion, is that we would do those plans for them.
Just do it for them and just be done with it and we're
Yeah.
move on.
For the smallest
That's the,
communities.
That's
the
the
below the
small-
blue.
Yeah, that's
Right.
the small
Yeah.
communities program. We would serve as consulting planners for those cities, or for
Yeah.
those communities, not just cities.
Right.
And I just want to know in that, because I think it's important, and this is something that came up in the conversations I had with people, is under the small communities program, we would be taking those in-house to update them, but it would be very, very important that the communities that are participating still feel like they have the ownership over
Right.
Yes.
determining with their community what the priorities are, the direction they want to go, and that they are making the ultimate decisions about what goes in the plan, and we would really be doing all of the technical work of the plan update.
But it should hopefully be more efficient because there's a lot of
Yes.
time playing phone tag between staff and consultants otherwise.
And the council does.
That's what I
all three
mean.
of us, yeah.
Met Council staff and consultants, we would eliminate that part of it.
Yeah, right.
So discussion, next steps, and we've been doing a lot of discussion along the way, but we'll just look at these, see if there are things we haven't
If
covered.
we haven't covered it.
Yeah. Is there interest in reconsidering the eligibility criteria for this round? And if yes, which criteria should be adjusted in-house? We've been talking about that. Does the concept and outline for the small communities program make sense? Do you have questions or suggestions for it? What do you think of the eligibility criteria levels for that program? And again, we've talked about some of this, we can talk a little bit more, and you can also take some of these away and think about them. And then finally, what additional information would be helpful as we move forward and refine how we're determining the criteria for the grants and for the new program.
Doors open.
And maybe I actually wasn't completely clear, Angela, what the next step is for this group, like when will we?
This is analysis and evaluation that we'll be doing throughout the year. And so we're really looking towards a recommendation from this group to the CDC eventually. And all of that impacts our budget, ultimately requests that we'll really be starting to work with council on throughout this year.
So we'd
And
be
so
working on it
depending
all
on-
year.
Yeah, depending
okay.
on the criteria, reaching similar levels of communities, at least in, as we did in the last round, we would need X budget. And so we would, carry what we're doing in this committee forward into those conversations.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
then when do you plan to have this all done and hand it to the communities to say, okay, here it is?
No, go ahead, yeah.
The grants, so communities will get their system statements this year in September, mid-September.
Okay.
And that's usually the kickoff for the local comprehensive planning process, even though we don't get plans until years ending in eight, typically. And so it's kind of the first step into that. So we would need to have grant funds available for drawdown and distribution to local governments, probably by mid-2026. Tentatively.
So we'll be talking about all of the things that you raised over the next year to figure out what's the best, okay,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Yes.
Go
ahead, Mary.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, ideally, even if the funds aren't available till mid-2026, hopefully we would be able to produce a list of who's eligible earlier so that there's time for those communities to think about whether they wanna participate and if they're even gonna get to participate.
Well, and we would need to have some idea as part of the budget process
Yeah.
this year, what we're gonna do,
Yeah.
so that we're, setting aside those funds for next year, because
We've been working on it already.
I'm sure you have. Jerry, did you have something?
But I just wanna say that my idea of grant money would be, if you need it, you should be able to get it, regardless of all the fancy words and criteria you use. And those that don't need it shouldn't get it, period. I mean, that's the way I see grant dollars. To me, is the way I see as you went through it, communities that don't need it, they'll probably take it because it's there, you see. And why should Met Council or anybody give the community money that don't need it? You see, that's how I kind of look at this, what you just talked about for this past.
Well, that's what we're doing, is trying to figure out.
Yes, I know that, I know that, but it's all based down on formulas. Like you mentioned, Angela, there are some communities, we're just gonna do their paperwork because we know how to do it. That's what it should be, do it, yes. And communities that need the money, regardless of how you figure it out, should be able to get it. Communities that don't need it shouldn't get it, period. I mean, that's just the way I look at it. That's how I think about it, I guess.
Do we have feedback from the past rounds of this as to communities saying, we wish we met the criteria, why is the criteria this instead of this? And has that all been sort of figured into some of these analyses as to what's coming forward this time around? Or have communities pretty much felt that the criteria matched determining need in the previous rounds?
Well, there's the lessons learned at the bottom of page 3 and top of page 4 in here.
I could start with a little bit I've heard, then you can say, you've heard more, Angela. There was a debrief following the last comprehensive planning round to talk about, what worked, what should we do differently. I asked about conversations related to grants, and the debrief didn't really focus on that, and I get the sense that if people don't get grants, they probably generally don't want to get on the bad side of Met Council by complaining that they didn't want to get a grant, so there might have been a lot of people that wish they had been eligible but weren't. I'm not sure that we got a lot of feedback on it.
My understanding is that in the last round, and I wasn't doing this work at that time, so this is just again what I've heard from others, is that we really did try to capture as many previously eligible communities as possible. We know that communities start depending on the grants once they become eligible, and falling out of eligibility is often uncomfortable. It does happen, and especially if the change in growth and financial ability and all of that changes to a great degree, then maybe it's appropriate. But I think that we did at least try as best possible to encapsulate as many previous grantees as possible. I know that there were a handful that did fall out. Obviously, we always hear about it regardless of what Merritt says. I don't think that communities are generally adverse to sharing if they're upset with us, and so, which is honestly, it's good feedback. Every time we should hear that, and we do recognize that it can happen quite easily. And I think Merritt's analysis, again, did our best to try and make sure that we weren't serving fewer communities, that we were trying to reach the communities that had need as it was defined previously. We can redefine that, but also to make sure that not too many communities were falling out of a grant program. And if they fell out of the grant program, we have the small communities program where we can do their plans for them if they want us to. And so just trying to provide backstops for communities that might not be eligible. Now, that may not necessarily apply on the other side of the bridge where we have, really populous communities, really financially stable communities, really, growing communities that are all at the Minneapolis level, et cetera, that are, chugging along really well, and they have robust staffs and weren't ever really a target of the program. And so it's that whole spectrum.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
One thing I was curious about, what about communities that submit the plan and then for whatever reason, well, it doesn't meet the criteria or whatever, or to that level that you're expecting? What happens then? They have to go back and redo it all again? And if it's so, how long does it take for that to happen? Or do you as a Met Council, as members, help fill those gaps in for them so they can get across the finish line?
We do our best. It happens. If a community submits a plan to us and it's determined incomplete, they're missing information, the information in one chapter is inconsistent with another chapter, maybe they requested a forecast increase or some other change. It happens with every plan, quite honestly, where we often have a back and forth. We try and do that before a community does that formal submittal, but it is driven by the community. And so if the community is like, no, we've done our first draft, we want you to tell us what's wrong with it. And we do that full review and we give them a whole list of things. If that's the way that they want to approach it, we're happy to do that as well.
Okay.
We have a program where we do preliminary reviews before the deadline, and we have obviously sector representatives that are there helping local governments as best we can, and we have the local planning handbook and a whole slew of other technical resources for helping with templates like Merritt mentioned, or with examples of this is what we are expecting, or if anybody wants clarity on anything, we try to provide resources for it. We also have a training and education program for especially minimum requirements, but also for things where you can get more out of your plan if you so choose, that we call Plan It. And community planners are really encouraged, and consultants are really encouraged to participate in those things so that they know what to expect as they're driving the planning process at the local level for each individual local government.
Angela, do you find that, what percent of the communities actually, do you have to go back and actually help finish those off? What percent is it? Is it very small, or is it 20%?
Just about everybody has to.
Everybody gets an incomplete letter prepared inevitably. We're working on that. That's
Okay.
one of the things that the debrief brought to light as well. Comprehensive plans are very complicated, and wastewater staff have very specific things that they're looking for. If a community has done everything perfectly, but the DNR hasn't approved their local water supply plan, that's an incomplete item. So there's a lot of things that are interrelated and connected when you're talking about a decennial comprehensive plan. So it does get very complicated very quickly. We try to head off any of that unexpected stuff where, oh, we didn't know that was gonna complete if the DNR, it was gonna be incomplete if the DNR had this problem. We try to be as clear as possible about what kinds of things are necessary for a complete plan. But I have worked on staffing for more sector representatives so they can have more direct assistance with individual local governments. We're trying this small communities program, which will be staffed separately, well, with some overlap, because Merit's obviously gonna be running that program. And doing a lot of other things. The small communities program will run at a different schedule than the other comprehensive plans. So if we're doing things in-house, we're hoping to get that done before the
big
other
pile of work.
comprehensive plans come in. So we've got 30 off the plate to get from the get-go.
Okay.
And so we're trying to pace things out a little bit differently. Where we can, we're trying to collaborate with our state agency partners to align deadlines. Sometimes it's not possible, sometimes state statute doesn't necessarily align itself, and so we're trying to do all of those things. So it does get complicated very quickly. So I know you're hoping to have me say, well, no, we had 10 incomplete letters last time and we're hoping to get to 5 this time. And that's not the bar where we're starting. That's not the starting line that we're at, but we do hope to improve every single time. And we will be talking about different technical assistance and different tools like the GHG strategies tool, the greenhouse gas emissions, the climate strategies tool that we have, doing specific training with local governments there. We had a lot of local governments participating in a climate summit in December, just a few weeks ago, that were really pulling together local sustainability staff with local planning staff. We had some public works staff there, not as much as we would like, but trying to pull together that local government team where the Met Council can help start those conversations. We were just talking at that meeting about talking some about minimum requirements. What does this look like for your local government? If this was the case, what would you suggest there? Talking about natural systems and climate. And we do those kinds of programs for the next 3 years. And so as soon as we're done with the policy plans, we switch to the implementation of. And so we're working to build that capacity internally as well. There's probably a lot more than you asked for, but.
Well, and as part of the feedback last time, the process got better as we went, because it was a little bumpy maybe a lot bumpy at the beginning, and it got streamlined as it went.
Inevitably, that does happen. It happened in the 2030 round as well. What I will say too with the small communities program is that because we're trying to do that early and first, and with local planning assistant staff leading that, we will be able to coordinate transportation staff and ES and parks and housing and land use. We all need to make sure that our requirements are speaking to one another, our comments are consolidated and consistent with one another. We're providing 3 different land use team members that are providing feedback on different elements, are responding in the same way for every community, for every issue, so that we're building that consistency before we get the slew of comp plans that we aren't doing ourselves. And so again, trying to build in some of that consistency earlier. Maybe the local governments then don't have to feel that bumpiness as much, but I cannot promise that comp plans are complicated and there will be some bumps. It will inevitably happen, and we're just here to help try and solve those problems as we go.
I guess from my standpoint, I could see cannabis emissions going up dramatically. Just saying.
I mean, it sounds like a solid
Just among planning staff,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly.
Yes, from a planning sense, we'll take that into consideration.
Sandy.
I just want to make a comment, and
not to toot the horn of LPA, but I'm tooting your horn a little bit now. I've sat on both sides of the table, and I've been through 2 rounds of comprehensive planning and sat on the committees at the city level that did the comprehensive plan, and that didn't guarantee us no letter back saying you're incomplete. We got an incomplete letter. But I can say honestly that in the beginning, the first round that I sat through, before they did preliminary drafts, I also am the one that sends that letter to your city. I don't write the letters, but I do go through them and I send them, and I can say that they started off being 10, 12 pages long before we did preliminary drafts. That shortened them up immensely, but I read all the comments from the different technical reviewers. So parks people talk about your parks component, water people talk about the water component, it's all different technical reviewers pull apart your plan, and they're experts in their areas, and they give a really good feedback. And having read all of these letters that go back to all the cities that did have gotten quite a bit shorter, they give really, really good insight as to this is like exactly what you need to do, and if you need help writing this, or I'm here for you, that type of thing. So that's where I want to toot the horn of LPA. The second round of comp planning we did have a grant, which was very helpful. Thank you for that. And we did the preliminary up front, and got the reject letter. And then it was very, very helpful though. And I just have to say that this continues to improve, and I do like this small communities piece. We're just over 5,000, but we're neighboring with cities that are much smaller, and I feel their pain, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing you guys are doing. So there, I'll shut up now.
Well, and I've heard some of our planners talk to some of these really small communities and say, I'll just finish it for you so we can get you through. So doing that officially is probably smoother than waiting for them to wallow in it for 3 years and then go, okay.
After they've hired a consultant
Yes,
to do it.
and spend a bunch of money, yeah.
Christina Smitten did ours, helped us. She used to work there probably before your time.
Okay, any more questions, comments? Do you have more questions?
I think the only thing I was gonna mention is if we have identified some people that are sort of the ones that are dropping out of the eligibility under this new way of looking at it, it might not be a bad idea to do some proactive outreach to them specifically about how this is gonna impact them, and I don't know what that will lead to, but maybe at least they'll know ahead of time what they're getting into.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, Angela mentioned we hear from the communities that were eligible before and that aren't. Who we don't hear from are the people who've never been eligible. And I think what I was suggesting in some of the tweaking of the criteria is, I think there are a lot of communities out there that haven't been eligible before but still have need. And so are we willing to shift a little bit in who we're focusing on? And if some people drop off, they'll be disappointed, but there'll be others who will be really grateful that they get a grant this time. So that's part of what we can, consider. So what would be helpful as we continue to dig into this and refine how we want to approach it? What can I do as far as information, or what questions do you want me to try to answer, for a future conversation?
Do we want a list of the actual communities? I'm kind of thinking that are eligible under the new piece. I'm kind of thinking that would be helpful, because as Wendy was saying is, you think about certain communities, you wonder if they're eligible, you don't know for sure.
Right.
You can see the old list, but that's gonna change for this new part.
Can you give us some direction on any preferred options that you would be leaning towards? Is growth important? Is population important? Is the maximum number of communities the most important? So if you can help us with some priorities, I think that would better help us narrow it down so that we can provide that for you. I struggle with providing some of that without us whittling it down a little bit first. I think that we can eventually come up with 2 options, and then we can have all of the communities that are listed for that and whatnot, and I think that we could do that.
I guess, if I may, what has the most impact on the community? It's gonna be either growth, or growth being population, or businesses, that kind of thing. That's where the monies need to go to. Now, I understand that some of the larger communities, they can handle it, but if that's happening to some of the fringe areas of our communities, those communities, the small communities, need to have some type of support. So I think that's where the money should go. I think was I should shut this down, but I thought, well, again, it's let's do the plans that involve the most communities.
Is there a reason under B and C, I mean, if we just made the eligibility for any of these to be less than or equal to 100% of the metro median in all cases, I mean, maybe we could just have one criteria, actually. You know, especially if we get rid of the 25,000 population.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if suddenly if that makes it, 75 cities, maybe that's too much, but.
It would make it a very large list,
Okay.
and I think, one thing I can do is I can do more analytics that kind of look at, if we use certain criteria, how many of those communities of a certain size are eligible or not eligible. So really understanding kind of who gets in and who's left out, and kind of the degrees to which we're able to cover people or not cover people, and that might help a little bit as well. But I was, in setting the eligibility criteria, was kind of trying to aim for serving about the same number of cities. So again, we could serve more, but they get smaller grants, so that's an important decision.
I'm still going back and forth on the growth rate thing. 'Cause,
Yeah.
I mean, I lived in Golden Valley when it was growing fast. I lived in Crystal when it was still growing fast. I live in Lakeville, which has been growing fast. And there's a lot of tension and issues to figure out that you don't necessarily have when you're not growing as much.
That's true. I think it's also true that some of the more established communities in the region, particularly if they're having some, if their net tax capacity is lower, they're kind of struggling, they're really trying to figure out how are they repositioning like brownfield sites that were former manufacturing places, how are they redeveloping housing that's become obsolete. So I think sometimes some of those planning efforts can be pretty intensive as well.
Well, and sometimes those things are going on in the fast developing cities at the same time.
Yeah, they could be as well, yeah. And then again, that's kind of like, a lot of land use and housing planning, but there's also kind of this baseline of wastewater service planning and water supply and these things that are
Stormwater.
a little bit more, regardless of who you are, you have to come up with all that content for your comp plan.
So the idea with the B and C is primarily to capture those slower growth situations in terms of, and this is forecasted growth, right? And then they're also the ones with the lower net tax capacity, which theoretically they don't have the resources. And perhaps one of the things they're trying to do is improve their net tax capacity.
Yeah.
If it's not through population growth, maybe there's something else they're looking to try to do in their planning efforts to
Yeah.
make themselves more wealthy communities.
Right, yeah, under the criteria that currently stand, there's many communities that have very low net tax capacity that aren't eligible. And so that gets back to that statutory consideration of need and how we define need. Is it growth, is it financial capacity, is it size, which can equate to sort of staff levels or expertise.
I'm still keep getting stuck on that per capita. I mean, that trade-off of do they have business or do they not impact on their net tax capacity? Because if you're totally a bedroom community, you don't have any businesses, that's a different looking net tax capacity than if it's fewer people and more businesses in there.
I think Yeah, if you like data.
I do, I
It
love data.
does.
The data,
I love just pouring through spreadsheets and
well,
maps and stuff.
the data set I got from Deed, they actually have, there's like 20 to 30 different ways of categorizing tax capacity. And it's, are you including businesses, are you including industries, what types of industries? I mean, it's just so many ways of parsing it. And so I used what they did last time, was you're considering residential and you're considering business, you know, kind of the whole shebang.
And it would be helpful to maybe consider what is the right column to be looking at in that list to really get at the need. The other issue is you could be a growing, changing community in terms of how many units are being built, but losing people at the same time because your houses that had 4 people now have 1, but you've added a bunch of apartments. And so that can have a lot of change going on too. And so making sure that we're looking at all of the sides of this, I think is important. I mean, when I was, Golden Valley has fewer people now than when I lived there in the 1970s, but they have a lot more units.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2040, the metro median growth rate that we were comparing against was 22%. And for this round, it's 16%. So we're definitely growing more slowly in this next 30 years than the last look back.
That's good. On the tax capacity analysis, I was just trying to figure out if it's better to look at it per capita or like per acre of land within the you know, the defined space of the city. And I don't know what the right answer to that is necessarily, but
Well,
they tell you 2 different
come out
things.
really good.
Well, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, that question didn't come up.
Other thoughts?
Well, let's say the Met Council's 4 units gets passed or whatever, how does that affect this program that you're talking about then? I mean, does that, by doing that, does that imply that there'd be more growth in populations then?
Same number of people, just squished.
Just squished.
Not the people, how close they are to each other.
Well, and depending on how much of your community you're talking about, we haven't really gotten into all that much, how much you'd have to update your engineering for different densities. And for a community that's mostly done, it's probably less of an issue than, say, Corcoran, where they're just starting and you're talking about the entire community rather than a portion.
So I'll bring more analytics next time. You guys are all gonna think really hard.
We always think really hard. I can't sleep at night because I sit around thinking about planning stuff, so.
Do you want me to send you those deed spreadsheets?
That'll put you right to sleep.
That might help you get to sleep.
Or at least go blind.
Oh, goodness, yes.
We will be, this is just the first conversation, so we will bring this back to the next agenda.
Okay.
Probably with some other things as well.
I kind of do like the idea of spreading to as many cities as possible, even if it's a smaller grant.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, I rather than way picking winners and losers, I'd rather help more people if we can.
Same. Can I ask?
I agree with that.
Can I ask clarifying too, is there broad support for the small communities program?
Yes,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Both from the
Thumbs up.
workflow side and getting those ones that are just, they just don't have
Lagging,
the people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
little tiny postage stamp community.
yes,
And I'll bring some of the analytics on that too, because you were asking about.
yeah.
And it seemed like population for the small communities program was the biggest question, making sure communities of 300 and communities of 500 were all.
I think it was population and tax
Well,
like, yeah, but it's kind of, whatever, it's two things
I
together.
mean, we're not looking to do small, very, very wealthy rewriting.
Right, but maybe a little bit more about how many are eligible under these criteria, how many aren't, and what's kind of the profile of
And
those.
how can we make sure we're covering the small communities that aren't,
Right,
Yeah.
Right,
but
Yeah.
aren't currently in the eligibility?
yes, exactly.
And we can identify too for the communities that are falling out of the program, with any of the changes that you're talking about carrying forward, like why?
Yeah.
Yeah, understanding that.
Well, that's where I was wondering if we tweak either the 25,000 number and or the net tax capacity number, do we gain a few more communities that probably should be eligible, that kind of thing, I think is, would be nice to know.
If you could have a map that would reflect that, those communities that would fall in those.
Yeah,
Oh, you
like the
have a
back page
slider
of-
on it, whereas you change the criteria, say change color,
Not in 2 months.
your data people would
No.
know, right?
Not in 2 months. I was gonna ask something.
Jerry, did you
Well,
have?
I just have a thought, maybe you can answer it. Okay, you said Carver County does it for all the townships. Do they do it for the cities like Chaska and Chet?
No,
So it's just the townships?
it's in statute that they are the planning authority for the townships, which also gives them the liability for planning decisions. And Dakota County could have been like that, but they don't want to be anymore. So they, in that case, if the township makes a mistake, they're the ones that are paying the attorneys and, on a land use issue. Like one township got sued over turning down a cemetery, and that went on to the township to deal with it rather than the county. So it's a kind of two-edged sword, control and liability. And
So Dakota County chose to step
I
out of that?
believe so. I think they formerly were like that and chose not to be
Okay.
anymore.
I was
Yeah,
just
it's
curious from a Scott County, and I'm sure you're thinking
Yeah.
like, when do we get kicked out?
It's been an evolution over time, so probably way back in the day, all of the counties had responsibility for land use planning for the townships, and over the years, different counties have at some point made a decision that they were gonna delegate that authority to the townships. So back when I started my career, my first job was in Washington County, and at that point, Washington County still did all the land use planning for the townships. At some point, they sent them on their way to do their own. Dakota County did the same. So the only two counties remaining that do that township planning are Scott and Carver.
But do you think that's the better way of doing it?
It has
Instead of
its pluses and
having the
minuses.
townships do their own? I mean, to me, I think townships should do their own.
I don't know, I look at it from, like, with Scott County, a lot of our townships get done first, so. And it's, that's off the plate for some of the smaller communities.
Well, if the county does it, doesn't,
It's not just the comprehensive plan, it's all of the land use
right?
stuff.
And so the county is dictating to the townships what they want. Yes, you see.
Yeah, so
And
you're.
the townships should be doing that themselves, I think.
I will say that both Scott and Carver County work with the individual townships. So it's a collaborative effort because actually it's the townships that delegate authority to the counties. Now, that's been so far back that it seems like it's always been that way. But for example, when the city of Credit River decided to incorporate, they asked for that planning authority to be returned to them, and the county doesn't really have an option because state statute gives planning authority to each individual municipality, the governmental unit is probably. And so because of that, the counties work my understanding, working with the county planning staff, is that they work very closely with the townships as they're doing the county's comprehensive plan, because the county has a comprehensive plan focused primarily on transportation and some of those other things that they're responsible for planning for. But because they do the planning for each of the townships, then they have in Carver County, for example, they used to have like a chapter for every township, and the township would get to choose policies A through 7 as it relates to ag. We want to do 1, 3, and 4. And then that would become the township's subsequent decisions, and that would then be what the county included for the township's chapter of for their comprehensive plan. So that's my understanding of how they've done it in the past. I think that the planning staff are really great at the counties, from my working relationship with them at least.
So the townships get to break up with the county, not the other way around.
Yeah. They often don't like to, because as the chair was saying, it is a very beneficial relationship for the townships largely, because the county then has to pay for all of those things and has to be the one responsible for all of those things, meeting deadlines and meeting different permits programs that they're responsible for, implementing the plan, setting all of the local official controls and things like that all go along with it, the budget, all of that stuff for some of these things that the townships then don't have to worry about.
And Credit River is finding out that it's a lot of work.
It is.
It is a whole lot of work.
Oh, yeah.
But you also have, like, every once in a while, there's a land use change that is contentious. And then it's up to the 5 county board members if it's gonna happen or not, rather than the township board. Jerry.
I think, well, I'm chair of the Board of Adjustment for Carver County. And I may have gotten calls over time, but we like this, see? I like to make up my own mind. And so, but you can see that Carver County wants to have kind of the authority of what goes on in the county. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think I run the board and my members, well, I think will agree that it's pretty independent. And I think sometimes we don't do what the county board may want. But, so when it applies to this planning things, you see, they're doing all the planning for the townships. So I was just curious kind of how that system works, you see.
The county gets to decide how they want to work when they're bringing them in as far as the process is concerned, because they're leading the process. But I would say the townships obviously have strong interest in it, and it behooves the county to work with you. I will say that I've known over the changing landscape of the region over time, there have been conflicts between what townships might want and what the county's approaches are, and windmills wind turbines being one of them.
That's been a big one.
In Carver County, I know that's been kind of an area of contradiction. So it's not always easy, so you're right, Jerry.
Well, I think it's just a good example of that is these solar projects. Nobody wants them really, yet the county, the way they did it, made it real easy to have them. And so the township, where they don't get built in Chaska or Chen, they're built out in the townships. And people who, not including the farmers, who move to the townships, they want to see cornfields and trees and this and that. They don't want to see a solar project there because there's nothing synthetic about it, there's nothing to look at, you see. So I think if the county insists on doing the planning, this is I found this very interesting tonight because I learned quite a bit about Carver County and other things, okay.
Well, we're almost to 6 o'clock.
Oh, my
Any
goodness, yes.
last thoughts? I didn't think we were gonna have a whole 2 hours worth of stuff, but
This was
You gave us the time to talk.
you guys did a great job. Yeah.
Shame on you.
it's a lot.
Any other final thoughts before we adjourn? Well, thank you.
To retire before the next round of comp plans go through.
Well, yeah, this
From this
is,
side of the table.
so I did the 2020, 2030, 2040, so this is my 4th one.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, I've been doing this way too long. Okay, well, thank you. We have
you,
no
everyone.
further business before us, so the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you for the.
Thank you for
Thank
the
you.
cookies.
You're awesome, as
Wendy,
always.
can you make sure I get off the break?
I can.